All right, let's get going. Thanks for joining and welcome to our monthly webinar series for the National Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the Park Service and help support the effort. Our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape and seascape level. As many of you know, we host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars in our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to DOI staff and the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And I've included links to both of those websites in the chat box. The webinar series is open to other feds and NGOs and other partners. So again, in the future, feel free to invite your partners and friends, colleagues to these webinars. We'll post a recording of today's webinar following the presentation, and throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in questions into the questions box. We'll revisit that the list of questions that have been entered following the presentation, and when we have the Q&A, and then if there's time, we'll also open up the phone lines so we can have a conversation that way as well. Today's presenters are Sarah Quinn and Steve Simon with the National Park Service's Geologic Resources Division, or GRD. Sarah is the NPS's External Renewable Energy Program Manager, and prior to 2011, Sarah worked for the BLM, where she was the Renewable Energy Program and Environmental Coordinator for Renewable Energy projects and planning initiatives on public lands in California. Now, as NPS's Renewable Energy Lead, Sarah is responsible for addressing policy issues relating to external renewable energy development and related transmission infrastructure, directing program activities and projects, coordinating across regions, and ensuring service-wide consistency. Steve is her counterpart with the external minerals side of things. And Steve joined GRD in 2008 as a regulatory specialist on non-federal oil and gas and ocean and coastal jurisdiction issues. He was hired as the external minerals coordinator in 2016. And in that role, in his current capacity, he's the conventional energy lead and provides parks and regions with technical, regulatory, and policy support on external conventional energy and mineral projects, including oil and gas, mining, and petroleum product pipelines. So both of them are kept busy around the clock, as you can all imagine. Sarah and Steve, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. All right, Steve, would you advance the screen?
Sure thing.
Just as a primer for this presentation, because it does go out to a broad audience, and we're providing that 30,000-foot overview of the program areas today. As you can possibly imagine, I mean, this is something that is a very in-depth topic, not something that we can quickly cover in 30 minutes. So for everything we will cover today, we could do a deep dive into every single resource impact topic, every single type of commodity and technology, and all sorts of legal authorities, the excellent work being done by our regional energy leads. And, you know, for the purposes of today, we won't be doing that. But if you had interest in any of those topics, please do follow up with us during the comments at the end. We'll leave time for comments, or follow up with us, you know, offline, and we're happy to do that deep dive with you, you know, at a future time. So, you know, obviously the basic overview is that Park Service has jurisdiction over 418 units at this time, but we also have important administrative responsibilities over a number of other program areas, you know, our trails, our LWCF program lands, and many other types that we try to engage on and that may potentially be impacted by energy development, even though we don't necessarily have jurisdiction over the land itself. Can you advance the slide? And so what we're going to provide right now is just a quick overview of the issue and the fact that these projects, especially at the utility scale, basically result in a large-scale conversion of land and water resources. And so that's the big nexus here to connected conservation, is that these projects, you know, over the landscape can have vast changes in everything from wildlife migration into watersheds. And so we'd like to kind of dive into how that happens. So next slide. And for starters, this is just to give you an idea, if you haven't seen these projects before, of what a utility scale solar project can look like on the landscape. Granted, we also are working on other, I'll say, smaller size community solar projects, particularly in the East Coast, that can impact, some of our parks out there and trail systems. The Western projects are of a unprecedented scale. These are basically the size of small airports and have a lot of unanticipated impacts, particularly the solar thermal projects, which you're seeing there with the power towers and kind of those circular fields. The technology involved in that involves molten salt and these tall towers, and it's mirror arrays, not photovoltaic, and the mirrors basically shine up at the towers, and then you get this light that is extremely bright when you're not looking at it on a screen. And so there's a lot of, this is the first project of this technology type built in this hemisphere. And so that presents in and of itself a suite of potential resource impacts that have never been explored or understood or studied before, for the types of, plants and animals that we have growing in the United States. So next slide. This just gives an idea of where the hot spots are for, solar technology. This is the solar photovoltaic map. It's slightly altered for solar thermal technologies, but, as I've no surprise to anyone, of course, the Southwestern United States is a hotbed for this resource. However, many of you may know that solar technologies are extremely common in countries like Germany, for example, where we wouldn't imagine the resource to be that high. And there are still, potential solar resources even in the northern climes. So it shouldn't be discounted that those projects can be built almost anywhere. Next slide. Land-based wind farms, especially for those of you who live out west, you're probably quite familiar with seeing land-based wind farms as well, because we've had these at commercial scale in the United States for a number of decades now. The advantage is that we do have a better understanding for the potential types of impacts, particularly avian impacts that can occur from these projects. And there's new technologies being developed all the time that can help mitigate those. What's not well understood by people when they see these on the landscape is that the construction process is pretty intensive for these. And so you can see that picture in the lower left-hand corner that, all of those wind farm turbines, even though they appear that they're just kind of, singularly placed around the landscape, they do work together. And so they have, transmission cables underground that connect them all that had to be put in place. Also, they don't turn at the same speed. And so that presents a very unique visual intrusion, both at daytime and at nighttime. And they also have, produce an audible sound, particularly large-scale wind farms when working together. And that has been associated with interesting health impacts. And so those are aspects that are still being understood, particularly when these projects are now coming in closer to the urban interface, or the urban interface is coming up to meet them. Next slide. And another map that would show you, of course, that the heavy wind areas both off the coast, and you can see both in the Atlantic and Pacific coast, as well as in the Intermountain West and the Great Lakes region as being some of the primary areas for these types of wind technologies. However, I will note that there's a number of issues that come into play with wind, not including transmission infrastructure. And one of that is the fact that it needs to be sustained. And so that's sustained around a 24-hour clock and sustained over different seasons. And so there's a number of variabilities that come into play with whether or not somewhere is actually a good area for wind. Next slide. And then this is offshore wind. And I like this graphic because it really puts things in perspective. The Block Island offshore wind project is off the coast of Rhode Island and was recently permitted. And this is actually a bit of an older graphic. Mary's on the call. I think she's probably muted, but she could tell you that they're now proposing to actually increase their turbine size yet again. And so they keep changing their technology, and so it's hard to keep up with. So I would estimate that, even these new halides that they're estimating would be almost as tall as the Eiffel Tower, they're going to continue to get bigger. So when you start looking in the future, by the time these projects get built, I would not be surprised to see that ones that are a lot taller. And if you see the Statue of Liberty down in the left-hand corner, that really starts to put things in perspective. When they are far off the coast, they're not quite as visible, but even if they're anywhere within 10, 20, sometimes 30 nautical miles, they can be quite prominent on the ocean landscape. Next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Steve for a while.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so turning over to what we call conventional energy and minerals issues. The first and probably the largest issue that we deal with at GRD is external oil and gas planning and development. And I say planning and development because most of what we do is trying to engage with other agencies on their planning documents and their planning processes. On this slide, you can see there's a couple of examples here of onshore drilling, offshore drilling, and also liquefied natural gas, which is becoming a bigger issue in the United States right now. I believe this is Sabine Pass down in Louisiana. For the onshore, most of what we try to do is work with the BLM. We work on their resource management plans, on amendments to those. We work on quarterly lease sales, generally try to become a cooperating agency with the BLM so that we can have a seat at the table and discuss mitigation measures and lease stipulations and try to get them to understand every way that we can avoid and minimize impact to Park Service resources. For the offshore, we have to work with BOEM, and BOEM has a different planning process than the BLM does, so it keeps it interesting. I'm sure everybody's heard in the news right now that BOEM is working on their next 5-year plan. We expect for them to release a draft environmental impact statement for that, probably either before the end of the year. If there's a government shutdown, that might be pushed out a little bit. So maybe January is when we might see that EIS come out. And then there'll be subsequent NEPA analyses done for individual offshore lease sales. Right now, it's possible that they're going to open up roughly 98% of the outer continental shelf to leasing. I imagine that would be streamlined quite a bit as we go. So with oil and gas, when we're talking about oil and gas, just kind of the big impact topics we're looking at, and I'll do a little name dropping for other folks who are good subject matter experts if anybody needs to get in touch with somebody. The biggest one is air quality. There doesn't have to be, the oil and gas development doesn't have to be right near a park in order for there to be air quality impacts. We have projects where the wells are 150 miles away and it's still going to result in negative impacts. And the ARD, the Air Resources Division, has great staff like Andrea Stacy and Kirsten King that you can work with. View sheds are also a big issue. Drilling rigs are large. They're there. They're visible from overlooks often. And Mark Meyer at ARD is the person to talk to for all of that. And then the other impacts we typically see are mostly impacts to night skies and natural sounds. So Frank Serena and NSNSD is somebody you can talk to. It's actually pretty rare that these external oil and gas projects are so close to the park that we have to worry about issues with water or wildlife or truck traffic interfering with visitor experience. Those issues certainly do come up, but the large-scale oil and gas we see is mostly on those other impact topics. This is a map that we put together just yesterday, and this shows the current active rigs in the United States. So this gives you a good idea of where the hotspots are. Right now, where the little laser pointer is, this is the Permian Basin, and right over here is Carlsbad Caverns and Guadalupe Mountains National Parks. This is where most of the activity is taking place, and then it runs up the middle of the United States, and the Bakken up in North Dakota is still pretty hot, along with the Marcellus in the Northeast. Intermountain region is really the region that sees the most oil and gas development, Midwest as well. So we have some great staff there. Joe Neubauer in IMR is the oil and gas lead. Adam Urena in Midwest region works hard on the oil and gas issues here. Also, Southern California has a little bit. You don't really see too much of it in the Pacific West. This map does not show offshore, but offshore, actually it does. Gulf of Mexico is really the hotbed right now. I think we're going to start to see some development in the Atlantic coast, maybe off of Southern California, but it's more unlikely there. Where oil and gas is probably the #1 issue, petroleum product pipelines, mostly natural gas pipelines, is quickly becoming issue #1. There are really 2 areas that we need to focus on as the National Park Service, and that's new line construction and then maintenance of existing lines. We do enjoy a little bit of, but we lack the authority, let me put it this way, we lack the authority to allow petroleum product pipelines to cross NPS units. So we don't have any authority to issue a right-of-way for that. Because of that, we don't actually see too many pipelines crossing Park Service units. There are certain exceptions. If Congress has specifically authorized lines to cross a park, then that's something that can happen. The other issue that is becoming more of an issue is existing pipelines. We're uncovering pipelines that predate the park or were put in without authorization, and there are maintenance activities that need to happen on those lines to protect park resources and health and safety of our visitors. So those are 2 issues that we're dealing with petroleum product pipelines. Mary Kruger in the Northeast region is the foremost expert on petroleum product pipelines. And I would also, anybody who has one of these come up, please give Truda Stella in the Lands Resources Division a call as well. Those are 2 good people to talk to pipelines about. Hard rock and coal mining is the other big external conventional issue that we deal with. As you can see on the screen here, this is a coal mine close to Natchez Trace Parkway. This Google image kind of gives a good idea of just how big these developments can be. Surface coal is really one of the bigger issues. Luckily, SMACRA has some protections built into it for the National Park Service and some authorities that we can use even outside of our boundaries. This is a hard rock mine outside of Denali. Kind of shows again the industrial nature of these sites. And here's an interesting photo. This is at Cedar Grove and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Bell Grove and Cedar. Somebody can help me out with that. Here's a mining operation in the back. It's either hard rock or sand and gravel. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is a Civil War demonstration recreation going on. And in the view shed of the park is this mining. Okay, so those are the top 3 conventional energy issues that we deal with, kind of the 30,000-foot overview of those. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sarah to talk about transmission lines.
Great. So transmission lines, as Steve mentioned, we do have the NPS rights-of-way programs in the National Park Service, and the realty and lands offices all need to be involved if we have a transmission line crossing the national parks. Truda Stella's on the line today, and she's got folks now in the regional offices that can assist parks on these issues. Just as a reminder, which is always good, but anytime we have these things crossing parks, they do need a right-of-way. It's not a guarantee that they're going to get one. There's a number of standards they have to meet. And as many of you know, we also have a lot of existing lines within parks that may or may not have the right to upgrade in their existing permit. There's also lines and other developments in parks that maybe were built a long time ago and were not built on a permit. So I encourage you to reach out to those people as well to make sure that we've got all the permitting aspects, including upgrades, squared away. This is a huge issue for national parks because almost every development that we just talked about needs to have power. I mean, even a lot of small oil and gas operations and other things need some source of power, so that may mean a smaller type of a Gentile line coming out to them. And then anything that's generating power needs to basically get that offloaded to the grid. And so that tends to mean interstate transmission lines, that can mean marine cables, and then also construction of substations. And so given the linear nature of transmission lines, oftentimes that may mean crossing parks, crossing trails, crossing rivers, or building things like substations, outside of the entrance stations to parks, which has happened in the past. Next slide. So why do we care? we're trying to give you the lay of the land, that these projects can be fairly massive, even if they're outside of our jurisdiction. But the important thing to understand is that when these projects are constructed and these projects are operated, outside park boundaries, there's a high potential sometimes for certain types of cross-boundary resource impacts that the Park Service needs to be concerned about and try to engage on to limit as much as possible. Next slide.
Yeah, as Sarah mentioned, we're talking about external energy and minerals here, so we always have to be careful when we're working on external projects that are being run under the jurisdiction of other federal agencies, that we constantly remind the public and the agencies of why we are commenting, why we are getting involved in these projects. And it all comes down to the resources and values of the national parks. And this is just a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are the big impact topics that we often see. And I'm not going to read the slide. You all can read it, and it'll be here for your reference. But it hits the typical resource impacts. But every time we say something, every time we put ourselves out there, it's very important that we tie it back to a resource of the National Park Service, be it a natural resource or a cultural resource. So every project, that's what we strive to do. And then to suggest and recommend mitigation measures, ways to avoid, ways to minimize impacts to all of these resources. And Sarah, hand it over to you.
Thanks. Something that I wanted to point out today was that there are a lot of unexpected impacts. I mean, there are some low-hanging fruits out there with some of these projects that you don't have to be an energy specialist to understand that there may be a visual intrusion from a project, or with oil and gas operations, maybe most of us would off the top of our heads understand to be concerned about, leaks and groundwater and surface water quality, for example. There are a lot of other things that come up from time to time that we don't anticipate, or parks don't anticipate. And this is where our team can help you in making sure that you don't get caught off guard. And so I just threw a few examples on the slide here, but a lot of times parks don't think about, and communities don't think about, the fact that these companies need to bring massive amounts of construction equipment on huge oversized trailers on their small county roads sometimes, and may even have to close the roads as they bring this stuff in and out for any period of time, sometimes months. And so we've been involved in things about whether or not things are road upgrades or road expansion plans or traffic plans that come along with these projects. People don't think about the fact that a lot of these projects require different types of safety lighting, especially at night, that projects may require groundwater withdrawal. And so that's something that came out fairly new from solar thermal projects, but even photovoltaic projects need massive amounts of water during construction, and also water for mirror washing. And so those are things we didn't always anticipate. Land conversion is another issue. When parks are somewhat reliant upon their neighbors, whether it's their counties or states or other partners in conservation, some of those conservation lands might be converted to industrial uses, and so that can put new types of pressures on the parks themselves. And altering that landscape for our recreation trails is something of concern. And then we also have emerging technologies all the time. So we don't have any utility scale offshore wind projects off the coast of the United States, or actually in this hemisphere at this time. So we don't know whether there's going to be acoustical impacts to marine wildlife. It's something that they've studied in Europe somewhat with the species they have in those areas. It's not something that we have ever been able to study or understand here. Likewise, understanding things such as solar avian mortality, until those projects were built, that was something, those words didn't exist. Now we have teams of people trying to solve this problem of birds basically getting incinerated by these projects. And so these are nuances, and so we're trying to keep up with these changes all the time, and can help you identify things that would maybe be unanticipated. Next slide. And so again, our team, and that of regional energy specialists and conventional and renewable folks, has worked on well over 100 projects and planning initiatives, and just over the last couple of years that the team has been in place. And so we have countless examples of all these impact topics, and so we've just picked out a couple to show you today, not to minimize the other types of resource impacts out there, because there are any number of them. But one example how these projects can impact resources in ways that aren't always anticipated has to do with animal migrations. Because these projects are happening at scale, you can see that the previously proposed Soda Mountain Solar Project, also known as Caithness Solar, is that large red area in the right, and the green line represents the boundary from Mojave Preserve. And then those two tan-colored areas are the two areas of bighorn sheep populations. And so, there's been a desire over a period of time to try to restore these black lines, basically some corridors between these two populations, and so to enhance genetic dispersal between these two sheep populations. And that has been a goal for a long time of the state of California and any number of groups and the park. And so if that project had been built exactly as it was originally proposed in that red area, it would have cut off those corridors and also really kind of occupied that landscape and provided a permanent barrier between those two bighorn sheep areas. Understanding that whole project area would have been fenced off, so that there wouldn't be likely be movement through that area in any way. So this is just one example of how these projects can have these landscape scale impacts. Next slide.
Yeah, so as another example, we can see cutting and trenching and road building that takes place typically with the long linear projects that we see, petroleum product pipelines being one of them, but also transmission lines, gathering lines for oil and gas facilities. These are the projects that leave a long scar on the landscape. And if you're in the eastern part of the United States, then maybe that would grow back and revegetate pretty quickly, except for the fact that you have to keep it clear cut for maintenance purposes. Out in the west, these scars, even after a pipeline is abandoned, can exist for an extremely long time. You can see them on Google Earth. These are impacts that are taking place outside of the parks, but often the construction itself is something that can impact the park for quite some time. It's a temporary impact, but it can have a lasting effect. Some of the concerns that we see with these obviously are erosion control, water quality. Some of these kind of projects can contaminate local wetlands and local groundwater sources. Invasive plants, habitat destruction, similar to what Sarah just talked about. Migration disruption for wildlife is an issue with these. Mortality, access points near wilderness. When a road is put in place, often it will be used not just by the company, but by the general public, even in areas that are close to the public. And it can result in changes to the cultural landscapes. Again, these projects are not limited to conventional. They're also similar impacts for transmission lines coming from renewable energy projects.
This is Sarah again. I would be remiss not to also make sure that we are talking a bit about cultural resources, and there's number of ways that utility scale and even smaller energy projects can impact the variety of cultural resources, whether they be ethnographic resources, historic resources, or archaeological resources. And so this is just an example that there was a transmission line that was proposed. Was actually a 500 kV line that was going to come within 2 miles of the monument. And for any of you who've spent time out west, 2 miles away is actually fairly prominent, visible on the landscape, and particularly from the monument itself. And so it wasn't going to directly impact the park itself. And yet, this is where the Park Service's role, collaborating with other agencies and collaborating with other tribal governments, is really important, because the tribe has very important relationships with 28 tribes and tribal groups. The monument is with 28 tribes and tribal groups. And so the park played an important role in bringing those people together, and different groups together, and making sure that the park, in submitting its own comments on this project, understood the position of these various tribes and tribal entities, and spoke with one voice about the potential impacts to this this important kind of ethnographic resource for all of these groups. And there were some other outcomes that came from us being a consulting party on the Section 106 programmatic agreement, one of which had to do with potential resources that could be encountered even many miles away. For example, some of the tribes had agreed that if in the construction of the transmission line, they encountered native remains during construction, that those remains would actually be repatriated as part of NAGPRA, but back to Salinas Pueblo Missions, who could then act as kind of that museum curator and holding those remains, ancient remains, on behalf of the number of tribes and tribal entities in the area to which you may not be able to identify, or that may be a common ancestor of many. And so that's, again, an important role that we can play in collaborating with, in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, and then the many other partners on this, to make sure that the tribes were well represented and that some of their important concerns were addressed. Next slide.
Okay, so we put this slide in here to kind of show an example of some of the technical assistance that NRSS and other divisions can provide to parks and regions who are facing these sorts of projects. This is a visual, a viewshed modeling analysis that was put together. Mark Meyer helped put this together for the Solar Programmatic EIS. And what it shows is from the high point here at Coscombe Mountain, what the viewshed would be. So if a company was going to want to site any sort of utility scale project here in this valley, we could then say, well, don't put it here because that's directly in the viewshed of the park. But if you move it over just a couple hundred yards, then it might not impact the park's viewshed all that much because of the local topography. So this is that Joshua Tree, and this was for a solar project, but the same can be said for any of these large scale oil and gas or surface mining projects that we might see. Just some simple siting and asking a company to move just a little bit over to the west or the east, if that's still within the area that they are allowed to operate in, is a simple way of mitigating some of those impacts.
And on that note, it's also the importance of it's really more important when it comes to planning, because, oftentimes when someone's already cited a commodity in a certain area, or they've tied up with an application for it's tied to a very specific piece of real estate. And so there's micro siting options maybe within the broader application area, but not the ability for them to move around in a broad way. And so this is a good example of why this team has been heavily involved in various types of energy planning exercises, so that we can identify anything from important viewshed areas to watersheds that are hydrologically linked to the parks, where we can say, these are areas that are of high potential for cross-boundary resource impact with our park resources, and perhaps there are other areas, even in the vicinity, that don't have those same resources. So, what we want to advocate for is not that these projects just stay away from all of our boundaries. I think the important thing to note is that sometimes these impacts can be avoided by micrositing, or by utilizing certain types of technologies or other types of mitigation. And so that's where the program comes in, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. Next slide. So we have a number of goals in place, and I guess they've never been formalized. So this is just kind of our interpretation of our goals. But obviously the primary goal of working on energy projects is that we have to focus on the Park Service. It is not our job to comment on energy projects at large and whether one type of technology is preferable over another. That is not the role of the National Park Service, and we have to stay in our lane. And so our lane is to make sure that we're meeting our trust responsibility with regards to these natural and cultural resources. Making sure that we are not that we are communicating about projects and processes that might impact the fundamental purposes for which the parks were created, because that was the purpose laid out by Congress, and we have that responsibility to make sure that can continue. We also need to work particularly within DOI. DOI also has responsibilities to the Park Service, even within Interior. And so we do work with many agencies outside of Interior, whether it's FERC or the Forest Service, but we do work a lot with the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management and with the Bureau of Land Management as well. So when we're within the interior family, we do have different avenues to work all the way up the chain through the department and the secretary's office. And then, the last thing is that we have a number of laws that apply, and we'll get into that in a minute. And we need to make sure, especially for those laws over which we have administrative responsibilities, that we're meeting our needs for that as well. Next slide. So Steve, I think I'm handing this over to you now.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, thank you. So building on that, legal authorities that we do have aside from the statutes like NEPA and NHPA, the big thing to remember with external activities is that we're outside of our regulatory authority. We don't have regulatory authority outside of our boundaries. However, our responsibilities to meet the Organic Act and the General Authorities Act do not necessarily end at our boundaries. We, as National Park staff, have a duty to protect parks any way we possibly can. And our management policies also guide us to doing that with other agencies. So I'm not going to read everything on this slide here, but this is just sort of a quick outline of what our legal authorities and what our mandates are for those areas that we administer. Organic Act, but also for some of those other areas that are not necessarily units of the National Park System. Certain statutes like the National Trail System Act, the Wild Scenic Rivers Act, National Historic Preservation Act do give us administrative responsibilities that we need to carry out. There are also some laws that are specific to certain commodities, certain areas, certain resource topics that do give us a regulatory or a legal hook, such as the Clean Air Act for Class 1 parks. I mentioned SMACRA before, that's the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. We do have certain authorities there to designate areas outside of park boundaries as unsuitable for surface coal mining. So here's a list of just some of the statutes that we lean on heavily in the External Energy and Minerals Program. Okay, Sarah, I think you're doing this one.
Yep. So we don't always have a federal nexus on these projects. And I would just say it depends, the same as attorney role. So, when there is a lead federal agency on the project, such as, FERC, BOEM, the BLM, we're also finding oftentimes the Army Corps of Engineers for, clean water permits, then there is a NEPA process. And so for the NEPA process, we have a cooperating agency status. And if we have to issue a permit for the project, that gives us a certain amount of jurisdiction by law. And that could be, it could be a small permit. It could be like a construction type permit, an access permit for them to use our roads if it's a Park Service owned road, or there could be transmission and other things that are associated with a project. Otherwise, we're typically engaged, particularly for external projects, as a matter of special expertise. And meaning that we, the Park Service, have unique knowledge about the potential resource impacts with regards to certain topics in the NEPA document, and then we can provide that information to the lead agency. I think that there's a couple things about this that are incredibly important, and one of note is we need to be value added. And I think I say this in a later slide, but I'll say it again because it's worth saying. We need to be value added. It's not our job just to poke holes in their document and say that it's insufficient. We need to explain why. We need to explain why that information is necessary, why those studies should be done, what is the value that's going to come out of that. We need to provide them technical information if we have it. Like, oh, we have bighorn sheep mapping data, or what, we have, hydrology data for this watershed, whatever that is, as much as possible, we need to be able to share that information, with the lead federal agency to help them in their decision process, and also be solutions focused. And then as we'll get into in a few minutes here, but we also have mandates now, that we are now going to be issuing these one federal decisions. And most of you are familiar, I'm assuming, with these kind of new and updated and, NEPA processes, and the fact that we are no longer going to be doing our own separate decision documents, even if we have a piece of a project. We need to engage with the lead federal agency. We need to participate in their document, or we need to add our permits to their document, and we need to do it on their timeline. And so, that's a big challenge for the Park Service, because we don't have a ton of staff devoted to this. That's not really the fundamental purpose of the Park Service mission, unlike some of these other agencies that are more focused on multiple use. So this is a really important role we can play. I will say, it's not on the slide, but we do work a lot with also state and local governments. And so this provides a template, I would say, with how we should engage with state and local governments. You know, they have their own permits, you know, and maybe at the county level, they have their own processes. Perhaps they solicit comments from us, perhaps we send them letters. However that process works, we do still need to, again, engage early and often, be value added, and try to engage in their process as they've defined it. And so that that applies no matter what system you're working in. Next slide. Steve, were you covering this one?
I can, and we're kind of running low on time, so maybe we can just kind of give a quick slide by of this one. So,
or I can just, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to say this is all the stuff we were just talking about. There's all these new executive orders and secretary orders requiring us to engage early and do it quickly. So here they are, and you can go back to the recording later and look them up.
I think we might be missing a couple that were implemented in 2018, but most of this came out in 2017 when the new administration was really taking hold. So these are limits on what we can do and how we can do it. So they're important to know about. Okay. Sarah, do you want to end with this slide?
Sure. For the last couple of years, we have had regional energy specialists in place. They were originally hired as renewable energy specialists, and now we've expanded the program to energy specialists, so they work on conventional energy as well, and we may be adding minerals into that in the future. Some of them are working on some minerals, kind of a bit on the side. And so here is just kind of a map of where those positions sit. We do have 6 positions. A few of them are vacant right now. Alaska and the National Capital Region do not have energy specialists. And so the folks that are doing that, I did put Joan Cluey here only because she's been the lead person on a Alaska pipeline project. But besides that, that's not really her full-time job. And so that's something that we're still working on with Alaska to figure out, you know, kind of it's on a project-by-project basis on who would be on first. And Patrick Campbell is just kind of the lead point of contact for National Capital. And so it's important, if you didn't know this already, that you do have folks in your region that are available to assist. If your region has a vacancy, then the rest of the team is available to assist. And so we do all meet regularly. We actually talk weekly, and we share information with each other. We share comment letters, and we share technologies, and we share, you know, try to share information that we've gleaned from conferences we've gone to, et cetera, with each other. So that way we can have, you know, an all hands on deck approach. And then do you want to skip ahead to the next slide, Steve, and then we'll get the questions?
Yeah, we do have two more slides, but we want to make sure that we can keep it open for questions. So we're just going to put this up on the screen so that you guys can see it, and know that this slide and one more are here for you to go back to and look at. But I think since we're running low, maybe we should go ahead and open it up for questions. So thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to advance it to the last slide, Steve? Just so. Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Steve. Awesome presentation. A lot of great information there. Okay, so it looks like we've got a number of questions that have been entered into the questions tab. Again, a reminder to folks, feel free to add more questions to our running list there, and I'm going to start reading through them. All right, Sarah and Steve, what new technologies are being developed to mitigate the impact of wind turbines on wildlife?
All right, this is Sarah, if that applies to me. There are a number of technologies that are being developed right now. One that I'll mention briefly, just in the interest of time, is some radar-based systems that are already in place on a number of projects. One being Spring Valley Wind in Nevada, and so that's a type of system that is designed for. In that case, it's designed for bats, and so there's a major bat kind of a roosting area near the Spring Valley Wind Project in Nevada, and so the radar is supposed to get notified or turned on if the bats migrate for their nightly flies, like to, I would say the north, towards the project instead of to the south, in a different direction. So if they come in the vicinity of the project, then the project, it triggers the turbines to go into shutdown mode. And then the turbines shut down for some period of time. So that is something that is deployed at Spring Valley Wind. It was just developed a couple of years ago. And so obviously there's monitoring going on in terms of whether or not it's actually effective. So that's just one example. And so I would say a lot of the technologies with regards to wind are similar. They do oftentimes relate to these radar-based systems that would then shut the turbines down. Some of them are also warning systems. So they're testing systems that, could the turbines emit some type of frequency, like an audible frequency that would be audible to birds or audible to bats, that would actually deter them from coming into the immediate area, so that way they avoid strike. So those are the types of technologies that are kind of in play right now.
Great. Okay, here's another one for you. How do we handle transmission line crossings or other crossings within park unit where the legislative boundaries, where the Park Service may not own the land affected?
Yeah, so I mean that's an issue.
She can answer.
Yeah, that's an issue that comes up with pipelines. Currently, there's a pipeline being constructed across the Appalachian Trail, which is a National Park Service unit, but we don't own all the land there. Some of it is owned by the National Forest Service, some of it is owned by the states, and privately owned as well. In those situations, it becomes very similar to any other external project where you have to coordinate and work with the agency that actively manages that piece of land. In those situations, we do have more of a stake in the game and more leverage to work with them, since it is passing through a unit of the National Park System. So some of our regulations will still apply, even if it's not federally owned. But we still wouldn't have the permitting authority to allow it. So at least for pipelines, it's different for transmission lines. So in those situations, it comes down to working with the agencies and getting our concerns out there and put into planning documents as best we can.
Yeah, and I'll also add that. Yeah, I would just say that, working with, the right-of-way leads is still important, even if it's through these, I'll say, non-jurisdictional lands. Even if we're not issuing a right-of-way, there may be aspects to the real estate between the parks and others, or there may be agreements in place that would be important to know. I mean, sometimes we do have conservation-related agreements with other partners, like the Forest Service, for example, on how those lands will be managed on behalf of the park resource, such as a trail. And so, we do need to advocate and ensure that if we have those existing agreements in place, that the other agencies are honoring them in their processes.
Mm-hmm.
Another question here. Will this be available for review again by registered attendees in the form of a recorded archived webinar? Can we watch it again? Essentially, yes. We are going, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted internally to our Park Service Connected Conservation Toolkit that can be accessible by folks from DOI, and then also we'll post it to the Network for Landscape Conservation website as well. And there's links to both of those websites in the chat box. How long has the Energy and Minerals Department been around in the NPS?
Well, the Energy and Minerals branch has been around for quite a long time. It used to have a different branch name. I think we changed it 6 years ago, I want to say. But the division, the energy function within the Geologic Resources Division has been around for quite some time. It used to be part of the Land
Over
Resources.
30 years.
Yeah, for quite some time. The regional energy specialists are, I guess, relatively new over the last 7 years, I want to say, 6 or 7 years, Sarah. You can correct me if I'm wrong. 6 years. So that aspect of it has been something that we've been able to build on recently, but the office has been here for quite some time.
Yeah, And just briefly, under the Obama administration, and because of the stimulus bill back in 2009, there was a lot of federal grant and loan money given for energy projects, particularly renewable energy at that time. And so there was a bit of an explosion of applications for projects on federal lands adjacent to national parks. And so the parks were being inundated with these types of issues and responding to these issues. And so the National Leadership Council of the National Park Service at that time had approved, I'll say, some project-based money to hire 6 term positions. So that would be folks in the regional offices, as well as Mark Meyer in Air Resources Division with regards to visual resources to assist with that work. And I will say, to the credit of the regional energy specialists and Mark themselves, they really proved their mettle. And so after being in place for 4 years as their terms were coming to conclusion, then up through NREG, the National Resources Advisory Group of the National Park Service, and then all the way up to the National Leadership Council, which is a senior leadership advisory group for the National Park Service, they approved permanent funding for those regional positions. And so we were able to then hire permanent positions about 2 years ago into the regional offices. And for some people, they were able to kind of convert, I'll say, somewhat from their term into the permanent positions. And so that is how we have those positions in place today. So in that regard, I'd say that it's new in the fact that we finally have permanent money as of about 2 years ago.
Great. All right, here's another one. How do you see NPS and their partners working to connect underrepresented groups, pathways or undergrads or grad students into the field of public land policy on issues like energy development?
That is a good question. I can point to there are some programs such as the Mosaics program and the Geoscientists and Parks programs that you can get involved in, and often those people involved in those programs, it can be a stepping stone to transition into this work. But that's really in more of the scientific research and study. When it comes to policy, the policy side of things it's difficult. It's difficult to do. Maybe that's someplace where we need to do a better job.
Yeah, we've had a few interns over the years, but not very many. So.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes, I guess, if assuming Sarah and Steve, you've got a little bit of time still. I'm going to go ahead and start opening up the phone lines. For those of you who entered your audio pin, you'll become unmuted and can ask a question that way as well. If you don't have a question, feel free to just put yourself on mute again on your own phone. And while I do that, though, I'll sneak in a question for you both. Do you guys have any tips or advice for parks or partners for engaging with companies and federal agencies, just more generally? Like working with an energy company, how should parks and partners go about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the biggest things is to listen to what the company is trying to do and to understand that that they also have a job to do. There are often ways that we can make the interaction between the federal agency and the industry group. There are ways that we can make it run a little bit smoother, which will pave the way for better relations in the future. That being said, typically, if it's a project inside of a park, then we have a set of rules and regulations that we need to follow. And if it's an activity outside the park, then the federal agency that's issuing the permit knows that they need to follow. So we need to stick to the law, but also be respectful to the other jobs that are needing to be done.
Steve, this is Mary. Can I add to that answer?
Please do.
So I think one of the things to remember is to reach out to your regional energy specialist if you have one, because your interaction with that company may not be the only interaction the Park Service is having with that company, and we need to make sure that we're consistent in how we deal with companies. I have companies I deal with where multiple parks are dealing not only with the same company, but the exact same staff. And it's really critical that we are consistent, because a lot of these companies have contacts not only with the department, but the White House. And if they don't feel like they're being served, they don't hesitate to reach out to those levels.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's another important point, Mary, is that, you know, for those of us who've been working on this field, and for the parks that have had these types of issues come up before, and these projects are highly visible. There's usually a lot of money that goes into them. There's usually members of Congress that are well informed on these projects. And so they have the potential to go sideways quickly. And the sideways part isn't necessarily part of the National Park Service. It can be for any number of reasons. But if they're not getting what they want, if the agencies aren't moving fast enough in the permitting process, if they feel like we're being obstructionist, if they're, whatever it is that comes up for them, they have a number of people that they can go to get their voices heard. And so it's really important that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take a strong stand with regards to resource impacts. It just means that we need to make sure that we dot our I's, cross our T's, and that we really have a high level of scientific integrity behind what we're saying.
Great point. All right. Any other questions that folks want to ask?
Hey, Brian, it looks like there was another question in the question box.
Oh, yeah. Mary asked if she could add to that response, I guess, you guys gave on...
which I already did.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. Any other questions?
There was also a question about impacts to Indigenous communities and communities of color. And I would say that the Park Service is trying to do a better job of making sure that we're engaging, particularly with tribes and tribal entities related to parks and how they might be impacted by a project. Granted, they may have their own interests and the Park Service may have its own interests, but where those interests converge, we certainly want to be speaking with one voice and not alienating important tribes and tribal entities that have a relationship with the parks and the resources that we protect in the way that we're commenting. With regards to community of color, I'll be honest, I think we haven't addressed that issue much, and we could do a much better job. It should be obvious to most people that development projects can oftentimes have disparate impacts on low-income communities and also communities of color. Oftentimes where they decide to site something like a big ugly substation or an electric transmission line or a pipeline or something, there's a number of reasons why they may choose to site something in certain areas, and part of it may be the cost of the land or how difficult it might be to get through local permitting and county offices, and how well represented those communities might be by their state and local governments and state and federal members of Congress. And so in that way, these communities can be disparately impacted by things like energy development. And that isn't something that we've really waded into before. It may be something that comes up on a future project and that we should keep our sights on.
Great. All right. It is almost 4 o'clock, so let's end it there. Sarah and Steve, thank you so much for your awesome presentation and for fielding all those questions. If folks want to reach out to Sarah and Steve, they can do that by emailing them, or I'm just trying to think, Sarah and Steve, internally within the Park Service. You guys can find them in your through your Gmail account. For non-Park Service folks, you can email me and I'll send you their contact information as well. But I'm sure that they're happy to field any additional questions that any folks on the line here who have joined today are sure they're happy to field any other questions you have. Our next Connected Conservation webinar is going to be on January 16 at 3 o'clock Eastern Eastern time. It's going to be a presentation on dark sky parks, and the presenters will be the folks from the International Dark Sky Association and the National Park Service's Natural Sounds and Night Sky Division. And that will be the first of many webinars for 2019. We're still working on our schedule, but we've got some great presentations already lined up, but stay tuned for seeing that full calendar schedule for 2019. We'll send that out to everyone and post it on our internal website and again on our website on the Network for Landscape Conservation. All right, thanks again, Sarah and Steve, and everyone else. Have a great rest of your week.
And thank you, Brian, and thank you for everybody for listening. Appreciate it.